welcome everybody to this event hosted by the Africa Center for Religion and Society. I'd like to thank you all for joining us from all around the world. And I'm delighted to have with me our distinguished panelists. My name is Jaye Edu, and I'm the founder of the Africa Center for Religion and Society. The world's attention is being drawn towards the impending global ecological and existential crisis brought about by changes in global climate patterns. Politicians, scientists, activists, and religious leaders are all making their way to Glasgow for the 26th session of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of the Parties, known as COP26, to discuss how we are to avert a global environmental catastrophe that threatens the lives of peoples and communities across the world. Africa contributes about 2 to 3% of global emissions, yet the continent will be disproportionately affected by global climate change. The impact of climate change is being felt in deforestation, rising sea levels, more floods, droughts, and severe weather patterns. Economic development, human health, and food and water security are all affected by changes to the climate system. The economic cost to African nations vulnerable to extreme climate patterns is projected to grow from $895 billion in 2018 to about 1.4 trillion in 2023. The consequences of climate change, however, are not only affected the social, economic, and political aspects of life in Africa, but it's also impacted on faith communities and religious practices in the continent. Insofar as climate change is influenced by human and natural activities, from causes to consequences, then fully understanding climate change therefore requires understanding its religious aspects, especially the way religion is involved in human interpretation of climate change. The current strategies in addressing climate change adopt Western theoretical and scientific frameworks, which are incongruous with African cosmology and worldview. And so the panelists in this webinar will discuss and explore what religious communities and people of faith in Africa can do and are doing to combat and reverse the climate crisis. And so it's now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel. We have Mrs. Shalape Hammond, who is the Special Advisor on the Sustainable Development Goals and Investments to the Governor of Lagos State in Nigeria, as well as Acting Commissioner for Wealth Creation and Employment. We have Maureen Wara, who's co-facilitator and coordinator of Green Faith International Network. We have Dr. Joram Tarusarira, who is Assistant Professor of Religion, Conflict, and Peace Building at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And then we're hoping to have Venerable Dr. Stanley Mweze, the lecturer at Department of Religion at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka. And last but not least, we have our moderator, Mrs. Lande Abudu, who is the Executive Secretary of Renewable Energy Association of Nigeria. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our moderator, Mrs. Lande Abudu. Over to you, Lande.
Thank you. And a warm welcome to everyone, to the convener and to our panelists. So we've already got some background on why we're having this conversation. Climate change is real, climate change is happening and disproportionately affecting Africa. So what are the things that we need to do to A, adapt, and B, mitigate against it? Where are we, and what sort of things and behaviors form our opinion on how to address it and how to make things better? So with COP26 fast approaching, what is Africa going to COP26 to give as a scorecard? And what are we hoping to take away from those very vital conversations? You know, so there's over 190 countries signed up to the Paris Agreement. Where are we, and are we on track for net zero emissions? What else do we need to do? So without further ado, I will start the conversation with our panelists. So first of all, I mean, it's probably an interesting concept, religion and climate change. Most people will think it's our human behavior, but part of it is our cultural beliefs, our religious beliefs, and all those mindsets that we have. So I'll start by asking, because I know that Dr. Joram has extensively studied this. So what are your thoughts on the church and what they're actually doing for climate change adaptation and awareness?
Okay, well, thank you very much. First of all, it's my pleasure to be here and to share the platform with all of you. And I'm also looking forward to hear your contributions and learn from you. By way of a quick response to what the moderator just raised in terms of what the churches are doing in respect of climate change, I mean, it is only of recent or in recent times that we begin to see faith communities or churches making some contribution to climate change. What we have seen for quite a long time was a perception of climate change as something that is only restricted to the scientists. You know, this was something that is scientific, something that is for climatologists, something that is for physicists, some those in physical geography, and many more interpretations would be more economic or political. So the churches are sort of coming quite late to the debate, and yet I think that is quite a disadvantage, because we can talk as much as we can about climate action, but not every action, psychologically speaking, is driven by one's motivation. And the motivation is pinned on what one would see as right or wrong. And the very moment we begin to talk about what is right or wrong, we are in the realm or the domain of morality. And we know that most of the moral understandings or underpinnings have a lot to do also with religion. So you see, this is how we reach to faith communities. And if we want climate action, we therefore have to locate all our economic, scientific, technological, statistical findings within people's beliefs, within what motivate people to act. So I would say churches are beginning to take an action, in faith communities, you know, also beginning to take an action here. Of recent, of course, the famous Laudato Si was a document that made a lot of headlines, where Pope Francis was also encouraging faith communities to do what he called environmental conversion. So as a way of partaking in climate action. Maybe I could stop here and we pick it from the next stage.
Thank you. Thank you. It's just as an intro, first of all, and then there'll be more specific questions as the conversation moves along. So Ms. Hammond, could I ask you a similar thing? I mean, on your part, obviously you have a public sector remit, but however, all these things key in together. So, you know, just quickly in a couple of minutes, what are your thoughts on churches and faith leaders and their contribution to addressing climate change?
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Very excited to be here as well. And this is a really important topic, again, as we all prepare to head out to COP26 this year. I think the role of religion, especially in the African context, and certainly in Nigeria, cannot be overemphasized. Religious institutions tend to be the gatekeepers and key influencers, as it were. The majority of us claim to belong to one faith or the other. And so the influence and the impact of what the gatekeepers, the religious gatekeepers say is extremely critical. I think it's also important to note that in Nigeria in particular, the religious bodies tend to be more than just influencers and gatekeepers, but they're actually very, very impactful actors in society. So we've made great forays in education. A lot of the schools, the churches started building a lot of the even far back in history, Methodist, Anglican, Catholic churches built the schools, the hospitals, a lot of the key social institutions that we all patronize and look up to. And it's the same, we've started building the private universities. So religion tends to be at the forefront of shaping the agenda at a national level. And for that reason, it's extremely important to, one, ensure that what the thinking is within religious circles is aligned to what the public sector wants to achieve. For example, the Lagos State government has a commissioner in charge of home affairs, which is really, they have the remit to interface with the religious leaders. Even in managing the COVID crisis, they were, consistently consulted. The churches and what they were doing and views on how things could run were very, very critical. So we can leverage this as a platform for how to address climate change. I think religious institutions for sure are partners in creating awareness, but also in ensuring that the right actions are taken and also being part of those actions that are taken. So I think that's a really important foundation for our conversation today.
Yeah, thank you very much for that contribution. Interesting to know that there's the home affairs angle of things, dealing with it, because obviously culturally we're quite unique in our beliefs and our belief system. So last but not the least, I'll ask Ms. Wara to please contribute, and based on your experience, what you think the church is doing to address climate action and the conversation.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Plande. And thank you very much, Jai. At first, I didn't know how to pronounce your name. I was like, okay. So thank you so much, Jai, for inviting me to be part of this panel. And also my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure, Joram and Solape. I hope I did that okay. So I want to first and foremost say that I have been working with faith communities in this sector for about 8 years. And to answer your question on what faith communities are doing right now to combat climate change, I want to say that they are in the center and front and back of message dissemination and trying as much as possible to look into their diverse religious teachings and check how best it is their call to work on climate justice or climate change per se. So I'm saying that because if you look at Christians, the Christians will tell you, or I will tell you as a Seventh-day Adventist, that the Bible calls me to be a steward. And stewardship is simply as probably Joram, who's a student in this department or who studied this department, will tell you, a steward is somebody who's supposed to take care of. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so at the same time, when you look at the same Bible, will tell you that you need to till land in order for you to eat. If you don't work, you can't eat. And so if we go back to the Quran will also tell you the same thing, that the earth is supposed to be revered and taken care of. And the Gita, which is for the Hindu, will also tell you the same thing, because they pray using every other thing that they see in the environment. They pray using stones, they pray using rivers, they pray using trees and leaves, So to answer the question is that it is a sole responsibility of people of faith to speak about the climate change agenda. Okay. It is the sole responsibility of people of faith to even champion the climate change agenda. Because the climate change agenda is not just an issue that would be left for politicians or an issue that would be left for academicians, but it is in the center of everything that faith communities do. So a practical example would be, how do you preach to a congregation that is hungry? So that is at the bedrock of food security. So a person of faith would take the responsibility of talking to the congregation about food security. And as Solape said, you and I probably would not listen to anybody as much as we would listen to our pastors and our priests, If your priest calls you to a meeting, you'd start thinking about, oh, what did I do wrong? So for that, the respect they command in every other stature that within their congregations in the society is so great that gives them the opportunity or the pedestal to speak about the climate change agenda, because when they do, people will listen.
Yeah.
Apart from that, you know, the climate change agenda comes with a lot of injustices. So when the injustices happen, again, the convocation of people of faith to make sure that everybody is taken care of, everybody is treated justly and fairly, then it becomes their sole responsibility to talk about climate change, especially when climate injustices happen. So an example of that would be, for instance, when corporations want to build power plants. And I think for those in Nigeria will say that oil flaring issues in Nigeria has been a pain for generations to come. So if faith communities in Nigeria would unite and say, we do not want to talk about oil anymore if we're talking about profit maximization at the expense of our communities or our congregants, then the politicians would listen. So to end it probably for the first session from there, I would say that it is the sole responsibility of people of faith to speak about the climate change agenda, to champion the climate justice agenda, not because it is the in thing or because of the scientific anything, but because it is deeply inscribed into the different, you know, faith books or reference books that they use on a daily basis to deliver sermons in places of worship. And the Laudato Si that Joram mentioned is one of those great examples where we can say that Pope Francis tried to you know, bring it to the attention of people of faith that it is their sole responsibility because it is written in the Bible and because they read it on a daily basis. But unfortunately, in Africa, climate change and climate justice agenda has not been taken as we would hope by people of faith. We are still on different spaces, but we hope we'll get there someday. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. So you touched on a few key things: inclusion and obviously poverty. So what I would ask Dr. Tyrus Orira is, what do you even think the average African person, does that person understand about climate change? Because, you know, the figures and whatever else, we're talking about literacy rates that are fairly low. We're talking about cultural beliefs that are wildly different to what people are normally used to when they hear about SDG 13. So, you know, I'd like to get your opinions on what you think the average African person thinks about climate change.
Oh, thank you so much. And so if I would think of an average African person here, I would basically think of maybe a subsistence farmer in some part of Africa. If we were to ask them about climate change, chances are high that they would ask us, what are you talking about when you talk about climate change? But that would not necessarily mean they cannot explain or do not observe that they are changing weather patterns and seasons have changed. You know, they see the changes, they see the wildfires, they see the floods, they see the droughts. So their way of understanding climate change is based on what they see happening in their lives, and they tell you that things have changed, and they can see we have observed the pattern. So when you listen to what they talk about, it's basically that things have changed and our environment is changing, and yeah. And that's how they explain climate change. They might not necessarily explain it in the scientific or technical terms that might be used by scientists or physicists and so forth. But you realize that they have their own language of talking about those changes. Not only do they have the language, but even when you come to solutions, they also have their own way of talking about solutions. And I think at some point we will talk about the importance of their knowledge systems. So they have their own knowledge system, which they also use to explain the changes, which we in the English language would call climate change. But they also have ways of addressing, which is mitigating and adaptation in ways also that they understand. And it's very important also to underline that the fact of them not speaking about climate change and maybe mitigation and adaptation in the language that we use in scientific terms shouldn't indicate inferiority or superiority in terms of knowledge systems. It's just a different way of talking about the same thing. But I think the tendency that tends to happen is to think, well, one way of understanding climate change or talking about it is not sophisticated enough to be part of the global agenda. And I think this is something that we have to think about more seriously as we move towards according all ways of knowing and talking and thinking ecosystems as we try to tackle climate change and encourage climate action.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Because I just think about, as you mentioned, changing weather patterns. So we might have, all the wonderful scientifics speak about it, but the rural farmer, for instance, he knows that harvest time has moved months from when he started and all that kind of thing. So they get it, and obviously would also seek solutions, and we have to just speak to them in the way that they would understand in terms of adaptation. So holding on to that thought, Ms. Hammond, what sorts of, being the Lagos State SDG champion, so to speak, what sort of messages is government sending out regarding, mitigation, and how, basically, what's the awareness programs, what kind of things are on course to get through to the Nigerian public?
Thank you. And I think Joram is exactly right. One of the first important things to do is to make it relatable to them, and not in a way that infantilizes them, because they do have their own body of knowledge, and in many ways far superior to modern technology and modern knowledge. But just to make it something that's very relatable, you can actually see climate change. No one needs to tell you about the increase in temperatures or the changing weather patterns. You can actually see that. I think the second thing is we then try to extend it as well, to go from even just being a passive beneficiary or someone who's being passively impacted by what's happening, i.e. the changes in weather, to actually showcasing to them where their personal actions matter. So for example, for those who know Lagos, we have an incredibly dense population here. Lagos is the smallest state in the country. It's less than 4,000 square kilometers, 3,507 square kilometers, but it's the most dense state in the country. So we have over 22 million people living here. So you can imagine what that means in terms of closeness, but it also has implications with regards to waste. Lagos is estimated to generate somewhere between 11 and 15,000 metric tons of waste every single day. Now, the challenge is some of that waste ends up in drains where people dispose of their waste badly, poorly, whether they don't want to use the waste management services, they just dump it in a gutter or dump it in the water, because Lagos is 2/3 water. And that has implications. It causes flooding, which weakens foundations when those buildings are repeatedly flooded. So there are actually consequences for our personal actions. So we do try to encourage them, one, to understand it in a way that's easy for them to understand. You don't necessarily need to understand the whole big picture, even though we will paint that entire picture to you, but to also realize that you have a responsibility and that your personal actions do matter. The third thing that we're also then trying to do is to create aggregates, to highlight the opportunities for them. So it's not all a tale of woe and doom. It's a call for us to use what we know and what we have, and perhaps what we even had in the past, to improve our lives. So I'm so excited about what I'm seeing globally happening with the reuse of banana leaves, the use of bamboo. These are things that we knew knowledgeably, even just superfoods, herbal medicines and more natural medicines. The whole world is gravitating back to where we were centuries ago. And we own that knowledge. The Chinese, the Indians, a lot of indigenous cultures have a lot of that knowledge. So it's how do we help our people to tap into these opportunities and go back to those ways of living. We've reintroduced a lot of our traditional foods into our events and how we live. How do we extend that and go back to a way that is a more natural, livable lifestyle that we had before today? The second is to then bring them into other opportunities as well. So Lagos is working on what we think will be the first, at least West African, flood risk management insurance scheme, which will enable us to insure the poor and vulnerable against flood risk. So Lagos is very low-lying city. It's one of the top 10 potentially climate challenged cities in the world because of the low-lying nature and being on the coast. And so it's important that we realize that flooding is, even though for us, ironically, what we typically suffer now from flooding tends to come from up country when the rivers flood. So it's not so much sea flooding that we are challenged with now, but there's a potential that as sea levels rise, and it's beginning to become inevitable that sea levels will rise by 2050. We need to prepare ourselves and have people be able to have a resilient fallback position with regards to getting a payout when those things, or if those things eventually happen. So we're trying to create a framework that then makes it, gives protection to our people and enables them to plan for a future where they, will then not be devastated if they lose their livelihood or their homes because of flooding. And for us, insurance is not traditionally acceptable here. Nigeria has one of the lowest penetrations of insurance in the country. I think a third of even or half of what Ghana is. So for us, this is something that we can also do to help our people begin to realize the value of making those protections and making a little investment to protect yourself against a big negative payout that may not be within your control later. So those are some of the things we're doing in the state, as well as, of course, just creating awareness. Everywhere you go now, you hear SDG, SDG, SDG. People in Lagos are becoming very, very familiar with that, but it's taking it beyond just knowing that it's there to actually having a responsibility to do something about it personally.
Fantastic, fantastic. Kudos to Lagos State for being at the forefront of those activities. So welcome, Venerable Dr. Nweze. Venerable Doctor, can you hear me? Okay, I'm not sure. I mean, while maybe we sort out that audio, maybe I'll go back to Ms. Wara and on the follow-on. So you're getting set to go to COP 2026. What are you hoping we're going to take away from there that will, I mean, practically, we'll get to solutions. We're still talking about, addressing the mindset and the kind of awareness and, what faith communities, the responsibility to the general public. But taking that to COP, what are you optimistic that there's something going to come out of the conversation for the African person? Because we are affected slightly more. I think the statistics are about 110 million people will be affected by climate disaster in sub-Saharan Africa by 2030. So the statistics are quite gloomy. So is there anything that gives you optimism going to Glasgow?
That's an interesting question. To tell you the truth, I don't know, but I'm positive because this COP, for some reason, has been publicized and branded a very political COP. Every other COP we've gone to or we've heard of has never been branded political. So that means that something has changed, there's a shift. So everybody else is talking about their 100 billion climate finance, and the question that is in my head is that, how did this figure come to be? What was the criteria for saying that we're going to, 100 billion is the money on the table? And then the second question that comes into my head is that, how will it be accessed, especially by countries from the global south? And the next question that would come into my head is that, why adaptation? And when they say that this time it is, adaptation and mitigation will be clumped together so that one is, looked at as a disruptor to the success of the other, that doesn't make sense still, yeah? But for some reason, faith communities this time round decided to make loss and damage one of the key issues that they want to talk about. So if we look at 3 COPs behind, COP 25, COP 24, loss and damage was not even touched on, and in most cases, it's because loss and damage only applies to countries from the global south. It only applies so much to countries that are harder hit by the impacts of climate change, and yet it is one of those issues that is never brought on the table for negotiators to agree that, yes, this is what we agree on. It is easy for them to, for the past COPs, for the negotiators to agree and the sessions to agree that, yes, this year every country is supposed to update INDCs, right? But it is not easy for them to agree that can we now put a face to loss and damage? Because countries, no country in Africa, I don't know about Nigeria, but I also think Nigeria has not even begun to discuss loss and damage, because then they don't want to get into the economic liability of it, because every country, I think to kind of double back to the first question you asked, every country or everybody does not want to say that climate change is here. They just want to say, all right, climate change is an act of God. You know, it's an act of God. It's a natural occurrence. Nobody has caused it. So governments across Africa and every other part of the world does not want to be responsible to loss and damage. They don't want to say, if a community is hardly hit by flooding and people have lost their homes and people are dying and the cattle is dying, then the government sets aside this kind of amount of money to take care of that community. So because of the economical liability attached to loss and damage, nobody wants to discuss about loss and damage, because we've got pastoralist communities and indigenous communities. Like for us in Kenya, last month, this month, our government declared drought national disaster. So we've got horrific photos of camels and cows dying in the pastoralist communities, but nobody is helping them, you know? So as much as it is happening in a country, and we can also put an economic value to every camel that is lost, to every cattle that is lost, to every farm that is heavily flooded such that there was no harvest. We can literally put an economic value to that and also draw a very straight line towards how this is affecting the national GDP for every country. When there is flooding, how does it in retrospect affect the national GDP? We can have those discussions. And we can also have a discussion of how does it lower the dignity of a community and the people that live in that community? How does it disrupt, you know, education? Because when there's flooding, if it happens in a school, God forbid, children will not go to school. Teachers will not go to school. And so how does that affect the economy? How does that affect the social, you know, activities of a country? So for me, to double back to your question, for me, I'm so skeptical on seeing what, for the first time, the sessions will come to say about loss and damage. Because as I said earlier, if you go as a minister, and I'm happy we have a minister, he's wearing a collar. So if you go to minister to a church that has lost everything, you know, you'll find hopeless communities are coming to church, families are coming to church, but they don't have a house because their houses were flooded. They don't have food because they don't have even money to buy food. They're hungry and they're stressed out. How much of the word of God are these people going to listen to? And where are they going to?
Sorry, hold that thought. I hope Venerable Doctor's audio is okay, so he can sort of speak to that. You know, you're hungry, you've lost your home, and then what do you say at the pulpit, Venerable Doctor? Yes, so
want to ask you a question?
Yes, so I was saying that the last thought that we got from Ms. Wara was, you know, there's hunger, there's poverty, you've lost your home through perhaps a flood, or there's been consequences in agriculture through a drought. So what do you then, you know, as a religious leader, what do you go up and preach? How do you respond to that? And how do you address the question that, look, at the end of the day, this climate change is real, it has affected you, but what do you then say to the congregation on service day?
Yeah, I want to thank all of you for giving me this opportunity to make my own contribution towards climate change and what religion can do. As a pastor, I think I have a great job to do to really see how climate change can be put on the country. As a minister of the gospel, as a church, we are people who are involved in or contribute to these climate change matters. But first and foremost, I'm expected to create awareness. This is my position as a pastor, to create awareness on the dangers of climate change if we people don't really protect our environment. I will also advocate that churches or environment should make to really grow trees. I know in those days we'll have trees in different church compounds, in schools. Some of these trees were economic trees and also serve as windbreakers. They help to control this issue of climate change. I also discourage my members from falling trees at random. Today, many places where we used to have forests, today those forests have been tampered with. To create the deforestation, people cutting trees at random without control, without replacing. As a pastor, I must encourage my members that anytime they want to cut down a tree, there must be a replacement. I also link the gospel to it, because there's nothing the word of God cannot control. We must put our environment in good shape so that the effect of climate change will be put under serious control. I was also try to make sure all the erection sites, I can encourage my members to be part of filling up where erosion are really done minor things, and then try to see how I can get the government involved. As a priest, I can get in touch with the government or the national government and educate them on the need to really solve this problem of climate change because of its effect on the people. I also encourage my members to go to agriculture. They must plant enough crop so as to have enough food on the table. Because without this food on the table, there will be serious cases of malnutrition and then set kwashiorkor, which may lead to the death of our children. So everybody, all hands will be on the deck to make sure that as the climate is changing, that the pastor is involved. It's not a question of begging the pastor, it's not a question of maybe appealing to him, but the pastor should take it as a responsibility, knowing fully well that he has a role to play. He can't just say, because I'm a preacher, whatever that's happening in the world, I'm not concerned, I'm not part of. No, a pastor shouldn't say that. A pastor should take the lead, get all the stakeholders, even in the community where we pastor, to have traditional leaders, traditional rulers, who can get them as community leaders to also educate their subjects on how to really come out for the menace of this climate change in our own time in Nigeria, especially in Enugu State, where I reside, where I live and work in the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. I want to really say that the churches in our area, through our efforts that we're making, are becoming very conscious of this climate change, and are raising to the occasion and seeing the need that something drastically must be made if we must be saved in this from this climate change effect. But without that, it becomes a problem for all of us in society. This is what I think I can do now as a pastor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the contribution. So so
Thank
I'd first of all sort of throw it to everybody that we have that conundrum between government and faith leaders. So essentially, they each, they all have their roles to play. However, traditionally, we know that we do tend to say, look, there's some secular things that we would like religious leaders to keep out of. We have been conversing and we can see the role that faith communities have to play, and it's very important, especially given the African psyche and ethos. So would you say that it would help if government formally partnered with religious leaders, actually formally partnered with them to impart the message? So I'll first of all put Ms. Hammond on the spot, being a government person, and then next would be Dr. Tarisa Msira. So you can be thinking about your response while she's in the hot seat.
I think the answer for me is a resounding yes. And as I mentioned, Lagos already does this. In terms of even promoting vaccine acceptancy, we're leveraging the religious institutions. In fact, I should have mentioned that my office actually created a platform, and it was really a brainchild of the governor, because we find that there are not too many places where people can just go and collaborate with government. So people who deal with government may know, but if you want to do several things, so you want to do something in health, then maybe you have to go to the Ministry of Health. You want to do something at Greek, you have to go to the Ministry of Greek. And so he thought it would be good to have a platform for all the do-gooders, and there's so many do-gooders in Lagos. We're wonderful people. People are always doing great things. So let's create a platform for people to be able to engage. So we created something called the Lagos State Volunteer Corps, where we actually co-create programs in conjunction with not-for-profits, development partners, private sector, projects that are targeted at addressing the SDGs, so tree planting, community cleanups, beach cleanups, supporting the education sector, healthcare, enumerating the vulnerable, one community at a time interventions. We commissioned a borehole today, toilets to address open defecation. So without a doubt, this is something that we can work together with the church and the other religious institutions on. So for us in Lagos, that is definitely a given. We want more and more collaboration. We know that a lot of the action out there in Lagos is not just what the government does. I'll also use COVID as an example. When the COVID lockdown happened, the governor said, look, you cannot shut down 22 million people plus and not feed the poor and vulnerable amongst them. More than 60% of people in Lagos are estimated to be daily paid informal sector workers. So they make their money daily, whether it's events or transportation or some sort. And you can't just shut them down. That means they're not earning. So we said, okay, we want to try and intervene 200,000 households. Let's start with 100,000. In 2 weeks' time, Flour Mills gave us 100,000 bags of rice. Lagos targeted intervening in 200,000 households. By the end of 4 months, when we were then able to open the economy more fully, we had done almost 1 million. And a lot of that was in partnership with the private sector and kind-hearted individuals. This does not include those that didn't work with us directly. We had individuals who were feeding gatemen and security officers and frontline workers on their streets, in their communities, in other communities. We had food banks that were doing work. Lagos Food Bank raised about ~250 million naira and worked together with 100 food banks to distribute food all across the country, all across the state. We haven't even included those numbers. So without a doubt, for us, it's a natural and very much desired partnership. And if any faith-based institutions are out here, or if anyone knows of any, we're very willing to collaborate on this at our office. It's Lagos State Volunteer Corps, lsbc.ng is the link, and we're also on Instagram and Facebook. So I've just done a quick shout out. Thank you.
Fantastic. I'll probably go on your Instagram page and sign up as well. So yes, Dr. Tarisa, well, what can I say? What would you like to add to that? Because there's always this supposed blurring of lines. Let's not blur the lines. Religious guys, you stick to what you know, preach the word, and don't get involved in government matters, don't get involved in legislation and any of those things. So yeah, what are your thoughts to share?
So thank you. I couldn't agree more with my colleague Solape, who just spoke. That this relationship is sort of desired and it is natural, because you are also talking about people who belong to both sides of the aisle. So the separation that tends to be called for, or that is imposed, is really manufactured, and it's not natural at all. But I think what is important also to give a more justification to why this collaboration is important is to understand, as we all know, that climate change is a complex problem. It being a complex problem, some have called it a wicked problem because it occurs over and over again. But so being of such a character, it means it also requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional and multi-stakeholder approach to handling it. And that already takes us to the call for collaboration between government and non-government actors, including faith communities. It's important to know that, unfortunately, we are where we are, where people call for this separation. I mean, you will agree with me that this separation between, if we say, religion and politics, it is an invention that came at some point in our history. It is a historical trajectory, it is a genealogy. I mean, you know as much as I do that the African chief, for example, is both a religious leader and a traditional leader. And but at some point, due to some historical developments in some parts of the world, not even Africa, religion was then labeled something that is, violent or not necessary. And this was as a result, of course, of modernization and secularization. So I think we are beginning to realize that the separation that has been made between religion and politics, or in this case, we say government and faith communities of the church, is actually what should have been. And these actors really reinforce each other. The government might come in with policies, technical approaches, and policies and models. And I think offices like SOLAPES have lots of these models. But these models can only make sense and be implemented if they resonate with what people believe in. That's what I said earlier. So they don't exist in a vacuum, but they exist in a context where people have beliefs, they have ideas, they have ethos, they have their culture, and they can only assent to participating if there is a resonance between the two. So, for, like as I said earlier, for a holistic understanding of the problem as well as the search for the solution, there is need to pair the different angles. That's why I talk of this sort of intersectional approach to handling climate change challenges, and that brings us to bringing together the church and government.
Thank you. Absolutely. So I think, there's general agreement all around that there's a role to play together in partnership, whether it's formal or otherwise. And the separation shouldn't be something we should actually advertise. It's more in our minds that we can seek solutions together, essentially. So, Ms. Wara, I shall come to you because I wanted to just touch on inclusion, and maybe specifically gender inclusion, and how does, where might you find the difference? Because we know that gender always plays a role in our adaptation or whatever else. Women, traditionally African women, would probably be more exposed to firewood smoke and all the rest of it. So what would you say in seeking solutions and trying to include them? Are they even heads of their households? Do they have a say in the matter? How does it affect them? Do you think it affects them? How much do you think it affects them differently? And how does that impact in our understanding and looking for solutions?
Thank you for that. And I think at some point, I don't know whether Jaye will do something else for us to discuss, because I'd really, really love to get into it with Joram and Solape in terms of the intersection, or how can the church and or the faith sector and the government collaborate for a common goal. That's something that I would really, really like to get into, because I have different opinions. But yeah, so to answer your question, number one, the faith kind of arena, let me call it like that, is a very patriarchal arena. The faith community is very patriarchal. That does not mean we do not have women ministers, but the mainstream faith communities are very patriarchal. The women ministers that we have are usually in privately owned, places of worship, which is another discussion altogether. But I I agree that women have not been included as much in the climate discussions, and it comes from the international space to the regional space, right up to the local space. And the twist to it is when we want to discuss issues to do with the energy access, you cannot discuss energy access without looking at the female gender. You cannot discuss energy access without including a girl child, because the people who, the biggest consumers of energy at a social level are women. Yeah. And so when you talk about commercial energy or social energy, the people who consume it more than anybody is a woman. But then the twist is women are not mostly considered even when we're looking at policy formulation, energy policy formulations. At this point, you don't get women being in the process of collecting of data so that we can have policies that address a question that has the biggest consumers having been part of that decision making. Yeah, and so when we're even talking about forest conservation, so that we talk about carbon sequestration, we still do not think about women. And to give a relevance to what the first questions you asked about, indigenous knowledge, women are the ones who hold the indigenous knowledge in forest conservation more than anybody, because we use the forest to get traditional medicine. We use the forest to get fuel wood. We use the forest to know where we have the cleanest water. Yeah. So even as we're looking at how best do we protect our forests, the first person we should go to, and yet we don't, are the women. And this brings me to the question of water protection of water towers. Also, that is a part that we need to harness the knowledge of women, indigenous or not, because it is the woman who will go 7 or 8 kilometers to go look for water. So she knows how important it is for her to protect the natural water stream, or protect the nearest water towers, or even how to manage it, because she does not want to take a lot of time looking for water while she would take that time managing her business. So what I'm trying to say is that even one of the things I usually do is that when I want to teach adaptation mitigation, I don't use those terms because they're too complicated, especially at the local level. I use the terms that people will understand. I say, because there was flooding last year, what can we do so that we protect ourselves before it happens? So that is mitigation. And then now it has happened. Our harvesting season has passed. So what can we do? So that is adaptation. So when you want to talk about adaptation mitigation, or even policy formulation in places of service delivery within the climate sector, women are the sources that we should be tapping into. Unfortunately, we've not been doing that very well as a continent, and that is the African region. But I'm glad that these discussions have started coming up. We have women champions who are coming up. Not more than we need them to be, but at least the discussion has started happening. The ground has started shifting. We have, policy formulation processes that go back to the local communities and have, local meetings with women and getting data that we will scientifically translate to put into our policies. And last but not least, again, the men in the call will excuse me a little bit. Financial managers, women are very good financial managers. And yet when we talk climate finance, in most cases, I can literally count in my finger how many times I've sat in climate finance discussions, and either I find myself alone, or I can literally count the women in that room. So I think that, as you rightly put it, Lande, that we need to start targeting women when we are talking about climate justice, because they're the ones who were impacted the most. And I want to start by putting in a joke, which is not really, that I use many times, that when fire, breaks out in your house, And as a man or as a husband, you're there and your wife is there and your 4 children are there. And then you have your laptop and your phone and your wallet, probably your car keys. So you're seeing the exit. Which one do you grab first? Do you grab your wife? Do you grab your children? Do you grab your car keys? Do you grab your phone? But for a woman, that is not even a question, because I know what the woman will grab first, and those are her children, strength or no strength. So women have not been involved as much, but I'm happy that the ground is shifting. And we have more women having these discussions. And you can even see in this call, the gender is pretty great. The female gender is pretty great. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So let's big hand up from, apologies to the men on the call. So I see Ms. Hammond with a wide smile. So what I'll do is I'll go from a woman to a man so I can pretend that we're including them. So Venerable Doctor, so what has your experience been in terms of inclusion on the climate change question? Venerable Doctor? Okay, so yeah, maybe oh dear, I think we've even lost him. So, I hope Venerable is not that Venerable ran away from the inclusion question. So, Ms. Hammond, again, in government, do you have any specific programs targeting, like as Ms. Wara had mentioned about this, disaggregated data, actually targeting women, climate finance targeting women, and women being at the forefront of climate action? Anyway, what are your experiences?
Excellent. So for me, I think I will agree with Maren to the point where we can never say enough until we're using both our hands, until both men and women are given equitable access to the table to make the decisions based on their skills, their experiences, their understanding, and the facts on the ground. We will always be attempting to fly and not really get off the ground. So it cannot be said enough that we need to empower women and let these women who are skilled, who are experienced, who have the knowledge also have a chance to provide solutions. I always say, if you provide a task, and this is really just based on empirical evidence, men they get excited about the challenge of the task. Women get excited about creating solutions. I think if the first 3 richest people in the world were women, they wouldn't be trying to fly off into space. They would probably be trying to solve a problem that is here on Earth. So I think that's just a difference in how we're wired.
Real life issues.
It's a difference in how we're wired, but there you go. However, I would have to say that perhaps Nigeria and certainly Lagos will be a bit of an exception. Without a doubt, there's a lot more work that should be done. We don't have enough representation yet. But for example, the Minister of Finance in Nigeria for the last 15, 16 years has been a woman. There have been 3, 4 women who've taken that role. But the Minister of Environment for State is a fantastic woman, Mrs. Ikezo. In Lagos as well, the Commissioner for Wealth Creation is a woman. The head of the Lagos State Employment Trust Fund is a woman. The head of LASEPA, the State Environmental Protection Agency, is a woman. I'm a woman, and we're all driving this change and climate change agenda very, very fiercely. So in Lagos, without a doubt, women, are very, very involved and front and center in the conversation. I think in the church, yes, indeed, at the decision-making level, particularly in the leadership of the church, it tends to be male-dominated. But you know what we say here in Nigeria is the man is the head, but the woman is the neck. And we will turn things wherever we think it needs to go. So the men may make the decisions, but the women are typically driving the execution. And we know more women go to church, more women take an active role in church, more women are there, not doing the theoretical leadership part, but doing the execution and implementation of the tasks. And I think that should not be ignored. They are part of that conversation. They will provide the energy to do the work that needs to be done. And I think that's there. On the side of the government, as I said, so we are very, very much mindful of the need for gender to bring in the female gender, in fact, disproportionately so. So the Lagos State Employment Trust Fund provides funding for entrepreneurship and to create employment. We have a fund that gives an average of about $10 million a year, so about 4 or 5 billion naira a year out in loans. But we have we set up a 10 billion naira fund. And I should have corrected, I'm no longer the acting commissioner for wealth creation. I only did that for a few months. And just now, there's a full substantive commissioner who's amazing, who's the commissioner for wealth creation and employment. So I'm just SDG and investments now. But while I was there, we created a 10 billion naira fund in conjunction with the private sector for women-led businesses. So we're very, very, in fact, we're typically accused of being partial to the female gender. But that's because we know that we need to bring women up to the point where they're enabled. And we know that historically they have been disproportionately disadvantaged. So we're course correcting, as it were. I know that the head of Imbile Oil and Gas, also another fantastic woman, Ms. Akinyoju, is also working on a program. So someone had talked about fuels, the important roles that women play in the fuel. So we've done our NDCs. And when we looked at it in Lagos, domestic fuel and agriculture were very, very high. Transportation was also very, very high. And we know that women are directly responsible in a large part for our energy consumption as it pertains to the impact on using non-sustainable wood versus using gas and other solutions. So we're actually trying to work on a study to facilitate the migration of women to being able to use more sustainable sources of fuel. So we are very women-centric in Lagos. It's something that we're thinking about. We're aware that that is where a large solution to the problem is going to come from. And we think it's a very critically important piece.
Thank you. Thank you. So Dr. Joram, let's hear from you. Do we need a feminist theology of environment and change, and climate change?
So I think that's a really great question. First, I would like to just acknowledge the great points that my colleagues have just articulated and so impressively. And I do agree certainly with what they've just put forward. I mean, you will remember earlier, I said we require an intersectional approach to tackling climate change. So what intersectionality, as a theoretical concept, says is that we need to factor in those elements that have been excluded, but also take note of the different oppressive systems that people are affected by climate change experience. And so this takes us to this whole exclusion and marginalization of women, despite the fact that they are most affected by climate change challenges. So, this is also why I really like the intersectional approach. It helps us to think broader than binary approaches, but to also really open up. And this will bring on board women. But not only just because they are women, but also we take note of the challenges that they've experienced in their various dimensions. And I think Marin really articulated the different angles. So without doubt, and I mean, of course, a big pump to what's happening in Lagos, that they've really already taken the lead in trying to address this challenge. We need a feminist theology of environment and climate change. The first point I would say is, but I don't want to go deep into this because I've also had some colleagues contesting the term feminist because some say, well, it was developed in some context and maybe how it is articulated doesn't properly relate to how we experience situations here in Africa. And I also know in the audience Dr. Elizabeth Mudzimu, whom I know worked on that. But I think that's not the point. The point is really that we need a theology that takes into consideration the experiences of women. I mean, I think it will be something that will be very much important for scholars to take on board and begin to articulate and theologically interpret these experiences that the women are experiencing. So we definitely need more reflection on that. And without doubt, of course, faith communities for the most part are patriarchal, and that needs to be addressed in the light of actually the mismatch between what the women do and who has the power to make decisions. You know, it's just a mismatch. It is those with more experience with the problem that should actually be given the opportunity to actually contribute to the solutions. You know, not just, you know, enjoying as someone said, you know, enjoy the challenge of the task, but to really focus on solutions, because you know, you can bring sustainable solutions if you experience. We don't say men don't experience, but we can't run away from the fact that women do experience most of the climate change challenges, and they have been excluded from these discussions for quite a long time. And I think and there tends to be, I can only concur.
Yeah. I mean, I'll still stay with you if you don't mind, because looking at the different angles of it. So we've talked about the gender angle and social inclusion angle. So another thing I'd like to touch on, maybe also because it's quite a deep topic at the moment in Nigeria, you know, what's the nexus between insecurity and climate change from your, because I know you have experience and background in that.
Well,
and what can we do about it?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, indeed, the intersection of climate change and security or conflict or violence is something that I really am interested in. But the argument that I've been making on these lines is that, I mean, of course, due to dwindling resources, competition over natural resources also increases. And this, I think Marin also gave the case of Kenya with the cattle dying, the camels dying, and so forth. But also, if we look at our context in Africa, in most parts of Africa, you know, the natural resources, there is we have a sacred understanding or sacred relationship with our land, with our water bodies, with our cattle, with our camels, and so forth. Mm-hmm. So what therefore this means is that when we don't have enough, when we have resource scarcity, mm-hmm. the way different actors or stakeholders position themselves in the conflicts is also influenced by the relationship that they have with the natural environment. So, but what we tend to see currently in debates on climate security is that if ever even people talk about climate security, if you look at COP26, with due respect to what's going on, but there's focus so much on mitigation and adaptation, and rightly so. Mm-hmm. But you know, we tend to forget that sometimes the situation goes beyond adaptive capacities, and when it goes beyond adaptive capacities, we find ourselves in conflict. But the nature of that conflict, if you go, for example, to Africa, it is influenced, it is moderated by the relationship that people have with the environment, and for the most part, it is sacred. So the argument that I've put across is that if we want to understand some of the conflicts that are going on, maybe Marin might correct me here, but as far as I've gotten to know, you know, we have recurring conflicts basically because our response to them are either only economic or political or technical or military or humanitarian aid. But we don't go to the deeper spiritual and moral motivations that influence how people position themselves in the conflict. And I think this is something that I think will be important if we want to also address what we call climate-induced conflicts or climate-induced violence. So this is how the intersection is like.
Uh-huh. I see you're nodding. Do you want to add something to that? I mean,
yeah, I love the way Joram has blessed it. It's remarkable, really. But the sad thing is that our policymakers don't see that. They don't see the intersects, because when he's talking about it, the first thing that comes into my mind is that when we're approaching conflict, climate induced conflict, we approach it, I agree with him 100%, from an economic perspective. But we don't look at the root causes. What is the root cause of climate-induced migration that results into the conflict? You know, the scarcity of land, which for the life of me, I don't understand why our African communities are so attached to land. I don't know why, fact that we can't share. So when climate-induced migration happens, then climate-induced conflict happens, because nobody likes people encroaching into their spaces, because probably I have 7 sons, and then all of a sudden I have a neighbor out of climate-induced migration who also has 7 sons. God forbid we have to share a fence. And then the African cultural values step in. We don't know where this person came from. Their culture, their value, their way of doing things. So we have to share our water towers. We've got to share our planting seasons. We've got to share our seeds, and probably we've got to use the same electricity, energy grid. So for some reason, we get into solving climate-induced conflict economically, and in the most part, it is political, so that we do not get deep into the root causes of climate-induced, conflict. And in most cases, it is climate-induced migration. So at that point in time, why don't we take adaptation and make it a discussion so that we prevent the conflict, the climate-induced migration? Why don't we take mitigation and take it apart, contextualize it so that we prevent climate-induced migration, and at the end of the day, prevent climate-induced conflict? So yeah, I love the perspective that you put in it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks ever so much. Just a quick sound check with Venerable Doctor. I'd like you to really be part of the conversation too. I just wanted him to maybe participate a bit as we sort of go to rounding up. And of course, in rounding up, we're saying, how do we seek solutions? How can we do better? So what are the deficiencies that have been, as regards faith communities and communicating about climate change, and how do we sort of get around it? So I'll just go one by one. So maybe I start with Ms. Hammond and say, in seeking solutions, in a minute and a half, what would you, what would be top of the pile?
So thank you. And I think this has been such a very exciting conversation all around. I think the key takeaway for me and the main way forward is for us all to acknowledge the fact and embrace the fact that we are all going to be part of the solution. It's not just no one left behind. It is everyone must get involved. We're not going to get anywhere if we all sort of hang back and wait for someone else to take action. Personal actions, collective actions, including the actions of the church and the members of the church, are extremely critical to achieving the SDGs. It's not just the job of the government, and it's not just the job of the government to define policy. It's everyone's job to get involved and define policy. And I'm happy academia was represented here today. It's everyone's job to do everything that's required. Secondly, we need to get to the point where the sum is greater than the sum. What unites us is much greater than what divides us. And I think just moving forward on the things that we at least agree on as important is so critical. That partnership and the alignment, rather than focusing on the areas of division, is very, very critical, because we get that a lot with government. You're unhappy with one thing, and so you ignore 10 other things that we could all, work together on while we're trying to resolve the issue that's outstanding. And of course, the third for me will always be that Lagos is ready and open for partnership. We are so keen, again, because I guess we're challenged. We don't want Lagos to be wiped out. I mean, there's cities around the world that have actually taken the decision to migrate. Jakarta is evacuating from some of their areas. Lagos is not going to do that. But so it's upon us, it's incumbent upon us to make sure we solve this problem. And we can only solve it with our best minds, our best hearts, and everyone's hands, on deck. So we invite you to continue to work with us, to be part of shaping the conversation, to volunteer with us and take action, show leadership, and we always are ready to have support from our brothers and sisters of faith. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect. So, Ms. Wara?
Yeah, and I see there are some people who are also dropping questions in the chat.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I just want to say that number one, for me, the best, or I think the best solution for us to take moving forward is that the first thing we need to do is that we need to stop working in silos. We really, really need to stop working in silos. Whether we are working from a faith perspective, whether we are working as a government, and I agree with Joram that the multisectoral approach to tackling these issues is the only way we can even reach a quarter of what we think climate justice would look like. Because at this point in time, for having been in this space for some time, it has even stopped being climate change anymore, because I mean, we can't keep up. But it is now climate justice, and we're asking ourselves, how is it climate justice? You know, how then that means that we have human rights issues associated with it. It means we have land issues, as Jaya has put in the chat, associated with this. So how best do we make sure that we bring the land ministers on board so that we talk about land tenure? I know land tenure is a huge discussion in Africa, and people don't want to talk about it because of reasons that we might not get into today. And another thing that I want to say that we need to think about moving forward is that we really need to build the capacity of our religious leaders. You know, we need to build the capacities of our religious leaders so that they can competitively and confidently talk about these discussions. We just don't need to talk to religious leaders at our congregations, but we also need, I always say that religious leaders are wildcards that we're holding, that when the government ministers are not listening, when corporations are not listening, bring them on the table with people of color and you'll see them cave. I have seen that happen. So these are our wildcards, but they cannot be, we can't use our wildcards who are faith leaders if we don't build their capacity. So now we need to, you know, build the capacities of our faith people so that they work together. And having worked in an interreligious kind of setting, I again know that you cannot only bring Christians on the table. Mm-hmm. It is important. There's nothing that scares a government than seeing a group of Christians and Muslims and Hindus and indigenous people, you know, on the same table and saying, hey, we need to talk, you know. Such kind of a force scares people. So it is a high time that we also needed to start, you know, enabling and creating places of discussion for different people of faith to sit together and forget about their differences in faith, to forget about their myths and misconceptions, but go towards this common value and common goal, which is combating climate change. And the third one, which I think is very powerful, is that we should stop boardroom discussions. We should go to the ground, because the impacts are happening on the ground. It is a high time that we build the capacities of communities so that we harness the indigenous knowledge and add a little bit into the scientific knowledge and meet somewhere in the middle so that they can be in a position to adapt and mitigate on their own, instead of us coming on boardrooms and having these discussions and going back home. So that's it. That is one of the things that I have enjoyed as Green Faith International Network's coordinator, is that the common thing with all the 14 Europe countries that I work with is that every bad impact that happens for climate change does not happen most of the time in cities. It happens in communities, in rural communities. So let's go back there. Let's sit under those trees and see what happens. You know, let's drink that colored water and see, you know, get how it feels, so that when you're advocating for policies that would make that situation better, then you're speaking from a factual point. And the last but not least is that we need to make sure that we protect our data. We need to document what we're doing. One of the things we lack in Africa is that we do a lot of work. I hear the things that Mam Salope is talking about. This is a great things that have happened in Nigeria within her docket. But how much of those are we documenting in a way that is not, it's not, you know, it's not colored? How many of these raw documentation are we doing? And how many of the pictorial documentations are we doing? So as a continent, I think we need to start documenting what we are doing, so that when we are speaking, we speak from a factual place. We speak from a documented space because they say if it is not written, probably it never happened. So I think that we need to start documenting and share the information. But most importantly, we need to stop working in silos. I love that, because if we work in silos, then we will be defeated. But if we work as a team, then we are rich in knowledge and we are rich in impact. Thank you.
Thank you. So Dr. Joram?
Well, I think great things have already been said, and I did not really overemphasize. Just the last point, the one point I had also was about breaking the silos. Like let academia come together, let policymakers come together, let faith communities and leaders come together, let non-governmental organizations, local and international, we come together. And I think our platform today tries to address that. Then we can share, reflections from different angles. And like Maureen said, we work in silos, we will be defeated. But maybe my parting shot would be, climate change challenges are not only scientific, they're not only economic, they are not only political, they are not only military, they don't only require humanitarian action. They are also justice issues, they are also moral issues. And as I said in my opening remarks, for action to take place, you have to tap into the moral motivation of people. And as we also know, this is where religion comes into play. And I think it's very important for us to really pay attention to that. We have no shortage of information and facts. People know, we have graphs, we have statistics, we have everything, but why is there no action? So this is, I think, a question that we have to take seriously. It's not so much about the lack of information, but it's also, and we need to continue really putting this information together. But let's also know that action is connected to moral judgment. It's not about the truth or falsity of the situation, but it's also about the rightness or wrongness, depending on who is the actor. And I think this is how I would look at it. Unless we go to the deeper motivations, climate action will remain a talk. And I think we need to really go to that. And this doesn't take place, of course, in boardrooms. It takes place in people's lived experiences. And that would be my parting shot.
Thank you so much. So, I mean, to kind of sum up all your contributions, we should work together, not work in silos, because obviously the sum of all parts is greater. We should look, and I like the point that was made about it's climate justice, not just climate action. There's an element of that. We need to build capacity of our religious leaders. So it's all right to, yap on about, be inclusive, talk to the congregation, encourage them, but we also need to continue to build their capacity so they're 100% current and they're 100% flowing with the vibe that needs to be imparted. And then we need to look to the grassroots and not look at it as conversations and not actions. So stuff happens at the grassroots level. We need to key into that relationship and manage that stakeholder relationship, and especially create awareness and seek solutions with them, mainly in that solution. And then we should look at, when we're working together, policymakers, CSOs, NGOs, faith leaders, government, everybody working together to seek solutions to combat climate change. So maybe I'll just, there are a few questions in the chat box already. So I can just start, taking some of those. So Antoinette had put early, and I think this might go to Ms. Hammond. So she says, thank you to the panelists for addressing all the crucial issues of climate change. And it has been, I must say, it's been very informative and a very enjoyable panel. So I'd like you to consider this. The individual life and activities of people in Africa do not immensely contribute to the huge impact of climate issues. And that's a valid point. But the inefficiency of systems that are supposed to protect our environment, an example, energy provision and use. So in terms of energy provision, if you don't have, you need to have access to infrastructure to be able to even start to think about, mitigating against climate change. So, what would you say to that? She says we need to think about that. And sitting in government, what are your thoughts?
Okay, so I think that's a very good question. Thank you, Antoinette. Without a doubt, the government has responsibility for the people. They're really the representatives of the people who aggregate shared resources that have been put together and make the decision, listening to the people, hopefully, as to how to use those resources optimally. So really, the government is nothing but an agglomeration of the needs and an expression of the resources of the people. Now, what I tend to argue is, without a doubt, governments in Africa, and I think governments all over the world, probably no one is perfect. I don't know any country where they're happy with their government. Even the countries that we like and think they're doing well, everyone always has criticisms because you can always optimize. So, it's a given. But I think for sure, even we can tell, even we in government are frustrated by some of the things that we can't do or don't do as well as we should. However, what I always say is, let's each of us solve the problem the way that we can. I feel there are too many things that people leave to the hands of the government. So for example, we actually don't require the government to solve the power problem of Nigeria. Renewable energy companies, so we see what companies like Lumos did, coming in, providing simple solutions for single households. There are people who are doing, these little lamps that are literally made up of salt water and bottles. People who are making bricks that address how we build today and doing sustainable materials. There is so much in the hands of the private sector. And I can tell you, the bulk of the good results that we get in this country are not even from government alone. Typically, they come either from the private sector or government, private, PPP, government and private sector and development partner collaborations. So please don't wait for the government to act. Don't wait for the government to know what to do. Work with the government. And I'm part of a hardware community in Nigeria, and I keep saying to them, the government is not going to be better at creating a plan for industrializing Nigeria than you are, and Manufacturers Association of Nigeria is. We need to bring all of you together. You bring us the plan. If you bring us a great plan, we'll be very happy to work with you to execute it. Or sit us down and tell us, these are the things we need to fix. That is the role of the individual. There are things that are within our power that we can actually do, and we don't need the government to do. And where we require the government, you can also inform the government, agree to partner with the government to implement, and we're very ready to do that. So yes, the government must be awake to their responsibilities, but we as citizens and the ones who at the end of the day suffer this must also be awake to our responsibility. I posit that there's a lot that can be done on the energy front with regards to food security. We see the great work that Babangonan is doing, for example, with single holder farmers in the north. It had nothing to do with government. It's just they analyze, these guys have no access to knowledge, which is readily available, good inputs, which is readily available, fertilizer, which is readily available, mechanization, which they can't afford, finance to get them through the lean periods, and a harvesting and market making approach. And they simply created that solution. There's so many of those solutions that are being created by innovative people today, and it does not require the government. So please, let's all also step up and act. And where the government needs to provide support, let them know. And we can all always reach government. We do when we need them, one-on-one for personal things. So let's do that when we need it for the good of the community. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I hope Antoinette is satisfied with that. It certainly explains it well, very well, and puts light on it. So I'll just pick out that you say, yes, government have their role to play, but individuals should also take responsibility. So if I could just quickly go back, I recall earlier, when you were addressing some of the issues in your own part of the speech, you mentioned about Lagos State generating, up to 15,000 tons of waste a day. And there's an opportunity right there, because I know that people have digesters and they have waste to energy solutions in their homes. And so we start to say, okay, look, if I can do this as an individual, how do I scale? And that's where government comes in. But at least we're looking for eco solutions first and foremost, and then taking it to go. So it's very, very important, the public-private partnership. And that's the only way we can drive change, essentially. So yeah, thank you for that feedback. So I have a question for Ms. Wara. So Nana says, really great points, I guess at the points that you made the point. So the question has been sitting there for a while, but she says that, how do you think faith communities can integrate an intersectional lens in their response to climate change?
A great one there. So, yeah, which is brilliant. Thank you for that question. And yes, so faith communities can not can, but should, you know, I was arranging it in my head. So faith communities should definitely, you know, create an intersection. So I like using practical examples. As I said, I like doing rural, you know, where the action is. So the thing is with faith communities, at least the ones I've worked with, the different faiths, is that in every faith community, there is a group, either a women's guild for the Catholics, and for the Seventh-day Adventists, we have a women ministries, and even for the Muslims, they have a women caucus. And so that goes to the youth, to the children, and also to the men. So what the faith communities need to do is that they need to adopt those groups so that they can deliberately talk about climate justice issues, so that they can deliberately talk about climate change issues. So when we go adaptation, which at the rural setting, I usually say, how can we keep up? So when you want to look at how can you keep up as a faith community in terms of food production, then go back to your faith community and say, let's do conservation agriculture, but let's not call it conservation agriculture. Let's call it farming God's way. So the thing is, I'm not a theologian by any chance, but I know that in the Bible, it is, I'm told in the Bible that do not disturb the soil. Leave the soil as it is so that the nutrients are kept together. So farming God's way brings that out. So as a faith community, we need to start talking about adaptation in terms of food productivity and call it farming God's way. Farming God's way is simply conservation agriculture. So for a Christian person to get it, and for a Christian person to say, now I can do this, you need to take science and translate it into religion, so that it is something relatable. Again, for faith communities, it is the same. One of the projects that I had that did very well in Congo was a project that I was telling them, adopt a river. You know, as a faith community, adopt a river. So if it is a river that is in close proximity to your church, to your place of worship, adopt it, so that you make it clean, so that you make sure that the communities around that place, you know, enjoy clean water, and which is very accessible. And then when you adopt that river, of course, you'll have a small community or a committee that manages and protects it, because probably the river is used by wild animals. People need their cows to go drink water. It is the same river. But when you adopt it, there's a way you can manage it, you know? So we have discussions that we can make alive from a faith perspective. When we're saying renewable energy, what are we saying? You know, talk to your pastor, talk to your sheikh, talk to your imam, so that they walk the talk. Walking the talk in terms of don't waste electricity if you have enough sunshine to use solar, you know, so that we take some of these things to make them as practical as possible. We've got actually the biggest percentage of schools are faith-based owned, you know, so why can't we make sure that we say adopt a light, but adopt a renewable light in every faith-owned school? So that is how I see the practicality of using your faith to further the climate change agenda. So in every sector, there's a way you can turn it around, even in policy making. So yeah, that is the best I can try to answer that question. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you, perfect. So I have a question for Dr. Joram. So Elizabeth asks, talking of intersectionality approach here, would you say that culture somehow limits women coming into these conversations, such as climate justice? And the next question is also for you as well, so take a deep breath.
Thank you. I think that's a great question. And so indeed, there has been a lot of oppression of women in the name of culture, unfortunately. And by now we all sort of agree that culture is dynamic, and there are certain things that we might, sanctify or sort of approve in the name of culture when they actually work to sort of push women off the rail and not really give them the opportunity to take part. So indeed, the culture can be, one of the many factors that the women have to deal with as part of the challenges to find themselves having a voice or being part of the decision making when it comes to climate change or climate action decision-making processes. So there is a sense in which there are elements that could be cultural that need to be interrogated or to be revisited as we try to, provide equal opportunity to everybody, regardless of their gender, to partake in this very important topic. So I would say, yes, intersectionality allows us to really reach out to all those different strands that have been part of excluding the women from participation.
Okay. So yes, I just wanted to, take, there's another deeper question, but I understand Ms. Wara has to leave. So I would want to say a very, very big thank you. Your contribution has been fantastic. I hope to be able to actually get in touch with you further as well. You have made some great contributions. And so thank you so much for joining the panel and your contributions, and look forward to somehow catching up in some way, and then we'll wait for the conversation post-COP. Thank you very much. So Dr. Joram, please, yes, you are still in the hot seat. So the question for you, yes, we just wanted to look deeper into what you mentioned about the sanctity of land, and the African psyche about, the religious people. Many religious people in Africa hold an apocalyptic understanding of the world. How do we address the idea that climate change is not simple cosmic judgment on the world, but our moral imperative?
I was just saying that, in most African contexts, the land is just not, it's not just a physical, chemical kind of property with, with mechanical properties, so to speak, but it is something that is sacred. And this sacredness comes as a result of different elements. In some communities, they would say, well, this land is where it was bequeathed to us by our ancestors, and it belongs to the future generations. So, so that attachment sort of assumes a sacred quality. And some will say, well, our ancestors lie buried here, so we are not, this land is sacred. So there is so much this, you might have heard of the phrase like, the land is the people and the people are the land. So there's an inextricable connection or identity between the people and the land. And this already makes it something that is very sacred in its definition. So be that as it may, it then tends to influence what we do in relation to the environment or in relation to the land, in this case. Staying on this land or moving, is influenced by this sacred relationship that we have with it, or its sanctity. So the very moment we're in this realm or in this domain, we are in the moral realm, as I said earlier. So it becomes a moral issue around the land, whatever, be it mitigation, be it adaptation, be it or dealing with crisis beyond adaptive capacities. So it becomes a moral issue. And when we look at the goals of COP26, it's about reducing 1.5, keeping 1.5 degrees within reach. It's also about going back to the natural habitats. It's also about working together. But what you realize is that you can mainstream moral and religious thinking in all these goals. And when we look at what's going on in COP26 right now, there is very little of moral questions that are being raised, but much of the effort, and rightly so, is around finance. We want to reach 100 billion, that's 100 billion budget, climate finance. That's really important, of course, because then that takes us to areas of climate justice. But we don't have to forget this other dimension, and which is our problem, sort of emphasizing one aspect at the expense of the other. And therefore we miss the holistic understanding of the picture. And I think for action, indeed, when it comes, for example, to land-related issues, in context where the land is perceived as sacred, we need to bring together moral and spiritual orders or logics with non-moral or religious logics, which we then call scientific, positivist, or technical. That will give us a good grasp for our desires regarding climate action.
Thank you so much. Fantastic way to round up. We need to mainstream the moral with the religious. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Venerable Doctor, I'm sure you can hear us. And thank you for your contributions. Ms. Hammond, thank you very much. And I have business ideas that I will bring to Lagos State for PPP. Thank you so much. Lagos State is very forward thinking, and I can see that you're doing your bits. Thank you so much for your contributions. And also Dr. Joram as well. Very insightful. I really, really enjoyed being, working on this panel. Thank you so much. And I'm sure maybe Jaye has a few words that he might want to say in closing.
So once again, thank you all so much for being with us this afternoon. I hope you've all taken something out of this, and I look forward to having you all again sometime in the future. Take care, and God bless you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you so much.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye now.